The Colombo family. The rally on June 28, 1971, tens of thousands of people converged on Manhattan's Columbus Circle for the second annual Italian-American Civil Rights League rally. Police barricades rerouted traffic away from the event. On an outdoor stage festooned with red, white, and blue fringed streamers, prominent politicians and local celebrities gathered to lend their support. Red, white, and green flags of Italy were unfurled beside the stars and stripes. Television cameramen and newspaper photographers shouldered their way through the crowd to get as close to the podium as possible. Proud Italian Americans from all over the New York metropolitan area gathered to voice their opposition to what they considered government prejudice against their people. They had a particular beef with the FBI. They felt that all Italian Americans were being tarred with the mafia brush. Just because a few Italians had established La Cosa Nostra, they certainly weren't all criminals, but the FBI, they claimed, treated them that way. Italian flag. The crowd cheered when they spotted Joseph Colombo, the founder of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, emerging from his car and making his way through the throng on foot. Oddly enough, Joe Colombo was the reigning boss of the New York crime family that bore his name. For some inexplicable reason, the League's supporters didn't see the irony. Joseph Colombo had started the League the year before to retaliate against what he considered unfair harassment from the FBI. On April 30, 1970, Colombo's son Joseph Jr. had been arrested for melting down quarters, dimes, and nickels for their silver content, hoping to earn more than the face value of the coins. As mob expert Jerry Capisi points out, the arrest was a pressure tactic aimed at the young man's father, but Joe Colombo cried foul and impetuously struck back by sending a gang of his men to picket FBI headquarters in Manhattan. FBI logo. But picketing alone wasn't enough for Colombo. He soon declared that he was forming the Italian-American Civil Rights League to address the issue of discrimination against his people. To the amazement of law enforcement officials, thousands of law-abiding Italian Americans took up the cry, sending in their $10 membership fees to the organization in droves. Fearing reprisals from Italian American voters, local politicians voiced their support. Within a matter of weeks, the League became a force of nature. 50,000 people attended the first rally at Columbus Circle on June 29, 1970. The mob ordered the docks closed for the day so that union members could attend. Stores in Italian neighborhoods around the city also closed in honor of the occasion. The huge outpouring of popular support for the League had its effect. United States Attorney General John Mitchell and New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller declared that the term mafia would no longer be used within their jurisdictions. The League named Joe Colombo its Man of the Year in May of that year, even though in March he had been slapped with a 2.5-year prison sentence for lying on his application for a real estate broker's license. The sentence was delayed pending appeal, and Colombo stepped up his efforts to promote the League. He even appeared on The Dick Cavett Show, a popular late-night television talk show, to discuss anti-Italian American discrimination. Some of the bosses of the other families were not pleased. This kind of deliberate self-exposure was unheard of for a mafia chief. Not even the egomaniacal John Gotti would have considered this kind of publicity during his reign as boss of the Gambino family in the late 80s and early 90s. By the time the second annual rally rolled around, Joe Colombo, the self-appointed civil rights leader, was walking on thin ice. As he made his way through the crowd on that summer day in 1971, he undoubtedly realized that he had ruffled some feathers, but apparently, he didn't know how badly he'd ruffled them. The knives were already out. Vegetabled, The Complete Idiot's Guide to the Mafia. After the first Italian-American Civil Rights League rally in 1970, Joe Colombo was able to convince many of his fellow bosses and their capos to contribute to his cause. How else would he have gotten the docks to close down for the event? But on December 16, 1970, FBI agents arrested Colombo soldier Rocco Mireia and searched the briefcase he was carrying. According to The Complete Idiot's Guide to the Mafia, the special agents found a list of names or nicknames and dollar amounts. Colombo, who was with Mireia when he was arrested, appeared before a federal grand jury and was questioned about the list. Rather than pleading the fifth the way a gangster normally would, Colombo, the civil rights leader, declared that these dollar amounts were contributions he'd raised for the League. Carl, he testified, was boss Carlo Gambino. Next to his name on the list was written $30,000. No doubt Gambino and all the other mobsters on that list wished Colombo hadn't been so forthcoming. The mob's initial support for Colombo's League soon dried up. The bosses felt that he had become too public, and in the mob, that was never good for business. Joe and Larry Gallo. Joe Colombo also faced serious opposition within his own family. The Gallo brothers, Larry, Albert, and the notorious Crazy Joey, had been chafing under the family's leadership for years and had already tried to take over the family in the early 60s. Joey Gallo had just been released from state prison in February 1971 after serving a 9-year stint, and his bitter feelings about the family leadership hadn't changed. Gallo and his brothers had long felt that they deserved a bigger piece of the pie for their efforts, and the YD proven in the past that they were ready, willing, and able to go to war to get what they wanted. The brothers also had a powerful ally in Genovese capo Vincent Chin Gigante, who would one day become boss of his family. As Joe Colombo muscled his way through the crowd in Columbus Circle to get to the stage, 3 gunshots suddenly rang out. People ducked, yelled in panic, and ran for shelter. Police officers fought the stampede to get to the source of the trouble. They found Joe Colombo lying on the pavement, blood streaming from 3 head wounds. A black man holding a pistol stood over him. Joe Colombo shot by Jerome Johnson. The police grabbed the man, but as they attempted to restrain him, a loyal Colombo retainer pulled a gun and put 3 bullets into the man's back, killing him on the spot. Police later learned that the man who shot Colombo was a street hustler named Jerome Johnson who had somehow obtained press credentials from the League. Suspicion immediately fell on Joey Gallo, who had a reputation for doing deals with African American criminals. Gallo felt that the mob could only benefit from cooperating with black crime groups, but many mobsters didn't like his fraternizing with them. Jerome Johnson, but police investigations and internal mob inquiries found no connection between Gallo and Jerome Johnson, nor were they able to prove that the gunman had been hired by Carlo Gambino or any other mafia boss who had a bone to pick with Colombo. Johnson was apparently a crazed lone gunman. Joey Gallo Colombo did not die of his wounds. He remained in a coma for the rest of his life, or, as Joey Gallo characteristically put it, he was vegetable. The shooting of Joe Colombo was just one chapter in the violent, strife-ridden history of the Colombo family, a saga that begins with one of the most despised mob bosses in the history of the American Mafia. The olive oil king Joe Profaci, the first and longest reigning boss of the Profaci family, was hated by his men. As soon as Joe Colombo took his place after his death, the family was almost immediately rechristened the Colombo family in an effort to erase the memory of his stingy, iron-handed tenure on the throne. Profaci's legitimate business, importing olive oil and tomato paste, earned him the nickname the Olive Oil King, but this business was only a small fraction of his empire. The Mafia Encyclopedia. According to Carl Safakis in the Mafia Encyclopedia, Profaci lived in a huge mansion on a 328-acre estate on Long Island, which boasted a hunting lodge and its own private airport. But while other bosses were often generous with their wealth, Profaci was a skinflint who taxed his men for the right to be in his family. On top of the usual percentage that a mob boss is entitled to, Profaci charged an additional tax on all criminal activities pursued by his men. Each family member also had to pay dues of $25 a month. Many of Profaci's wise guys complained behind his back that he was just another mean, tight-fisted mustache Pete, but Profaci saw himself as a traditionalist who lived by the code of the original Sicilian Mafia. Profaci was a clever survivor who managed to steer clear of the upheaval of the Castellamarese War in 1931, keeping his family intact while the Young Turks, led by Lucky Luciano, were carving up the remains of Salvatore Maranzano's family. The Profaci family, which was based in Brooklyn and parts of Staten Island, pursued the usual mob enterprises: labor rackets, gambling, hijacking, loan sharking, and extortion, later adding heroin importation to its portfolio. Profaci maintained a close alliance with Bonanno family boss Joseph Bonanno, and together they were powerful enough to scare off the other encroaching New York families. Profaci ruled his family for 3 decades without a serious challenge to his leadership. But by the beginning of the 1960s, the bosses of the Gambino, Lucchese, and Genovese families were ready for a shift in the power alignment in New York. The Profaci-Bonanno alliance had become an 800-pound gorilla, frequently getting in their way. As mob expert Jerry Capisi points out, Carlo Gambino, who sought out allies among Profaci's men, fomented trouble from within. The Gallo brothers, Lawrence, Albert, and Joey, along with their crew from the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, had been dissatisfied with Profaci's leadership for some time. They scratched out a living with their rackets, but because Profaci always took a big chunk of their profits, they felt that they weren't getting ahead. They were particularly bitter about the Profaci-ordered execution of fellow crew member Frankie Schatz Abatamarco. Profaci felt that Frankie Schatz, a numbers banker, had become disloyal and disrespectful in withholding tribute to the boss. The Gallos didn't dispute the charge but felt that the punishment far outweighed the gravity of the crime. Joseph Maglioco. By February 1961, the Gallo crew had finally had enough. In a bold move, they kidnapped several prominent members of the family, including longtime underboss Joseph Maglioco and capo Joe Colombo. The gallows then sent word to Profaci that they wanted some changes made in the way profits were divvied up. Profaci sent his consigliere Charles the Siglo Cicero to negotiate with them. After weeks of negotiations, the two sides came to an agreement, and the hostages were released. Everyone was apparently happy with the outcome. Larry Gallo, but 6 months later, Profaci retaliated. One of the hostages, soldier John Simone, lured Larry Gallo to a bar in Brooklyn, where two thugs threw a rope around his neck and started to choke him. They threatened to kill him if he didn't call his brothers and tell them to come to the bar. Larry Gallo knew he and his brothers would all be dead if he did that, so he refused to cooperate. The rope was pulled tighter, and Gallo would have been a goner if a policeman hadn't suddenly walked in. The front door of the bar had been left ajar, and because it was a Sunday, and blue laws demanded that all commercial establishments close shop on Sundays, the cop came in to investigate. Simone and his thugs ran for the door. The cop's partner tried to stop them, but one of the hoods shot him in the face. They escaped in a waiting Cadillac. The gallows then learned that Profaci's men had killed their chief enforcer, Joseph Joe Joelli, a few days earlier. The Gallo crew lashed out, taking potshots at Profaci loyalists wherever they found them. The police raided the Gallo crew's headquarters in Brooklyn, hoping to head off an all-out war within the family. The violence subsided, but the bitterness festered. Profaci's troubles weren't relegated to internal matters. In early 1962, Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese went before the Mafia Commission and proposed that Profaci retire as boss for the good of his family and the mob in general. Joe Bonanno vehemently objected to such a move, fearing that he'd lose his most important ally. The commission decided not to decide in this matter, and it became a moot point when Profaci succumbed to cancer on June 6, 1962. Joseph Maglioco, Profaci's underboss, Joseph Maglioco, was quickly installed as boss, which did not please Lucchese and Gambino. From all indications, Maglioco would faithfully carry on with Profaci's policies, including the close alliance with Joe Bonanno. For that reason, the old boss' enemies automatically became the new boss's enemies. Trouble and more trouble. Persico Jr. Persico Joe Maglioco must have had days when he regretted taking over as boss of Profaci's family. The Gallo crew still wasn't happy, and they came at him with a vengeance, determined to bring him down. Hoping to weaken Maglioco's hold on the family, they targeted his strongest men, particularly the fierce Carmen Jr. Persico. Persico's car was bombed in 1963, but he escaped with only minor injuries. On May 19 of that year, he was shot in the face, hand, and shoulder, according to mob expert Jerry Capisi, in a drive-by shooting orchestrated by the Gallows. Persico was reportedly so tough he spat out one of the bullets that entered his face. In another incident, Persico's chief enforcer, Hugh McIntosh, a giant of a man who wore a size 52 suit, was ambushed and shot but managed to survive. But the Gallo revolt came to an abrupt halt in the fall of 1963, when 2 key crew members were murdered and 17 others were indicted on a variety of racketeering charges. With Joey Gallo already almost 2 years into a lengthy prison sentence, the Gallo crew just didn't have the manpower to keep the fight going. Stefano Maglioco may have been relieved to have the pesky Gallo crew off his back, but his real troubles were just beginning. He had inherited Joe Profaci's alliance with the Bonanno family, but he was an indecisive leader and unfortunately for him took his cues from the ambitious Joe Bonanno. Before Profaci died, he and Bonanno had been plotting the assassination of their chief nemeses, bosses Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and Stefano Magadino of the Buffalo family, who also happened to be Bonanno's cousin. Bonanno's goal was to get rid of his enemies and install himself as Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses and head of the commission. Following Profaci's wishes, Maglioco went along with the plot. Bonanno gave Maglioco the task of having Gambino and Lucchese whacked, and Maglioco passed the contract on to one of his most loyal hitmen, Joe Colombo. Maglioco was confident that Colombo would get the job done. But Colombo had a mind of his own, and he could see which way the wind was blowing. After assessing the situation, he decided that Bonanno was too power-hungry, and his attempt to take over the commission would ultimately fail, leaving the Profaci family holding the bag. So instead of carrying out the executions, Colombo informed Lucchese and Gambino of the conspiracy. They in turn went to the commission and demanded justice. The commission did not want to see another Castellamarese war, so they exercised their regulatory powers and summoned Maglioco and Bonanno to appear before them. Bonanno defied the order and went into hiding. Maglioco obeyed the order and admitted his part in the conspiracy. The commission took pity on him, knowing that the devious Bonanno had to have been the driving force behind the plot. Maglioco was fined $50,000 and forced to retire. They spared his life, but Maglioco had a heart attack and died a few months later. Carlo Gambino. At the suggestion of Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo was rewarded for his part in thwarting the conspiracy and made the new boss of the Profaci family. Gambino would come to regret that endorsement when Colombo and his love of publicity threw an unwanted spotlight on the organized crime underworld. Star power. As a young man, Joe Colombo made his mark as part of Joe Profaci's elite execution squad, a 5-man hit team that included Larry and Joey Gallo. When you killed with the Gallo boys, Carl Safakis writes in the Mafia Encyclopedia, you killed with the best. In addition to his hitman duties, Colombo initially worked as an enforcer on the docks, then moved up to running gambling dens, hijacking, and loan sharking. But perhaps what formed his thinking more than any of his criminal experiences was the gangland slaying of his father, Anthony Colombo, who was found garroted in his car along with his girlfriend. Joe Colombo knew firsthand how quickly a wise guy can fall out of favor and be exterminated. Colombo was probably thinking of his father's fate when he decided that siding with Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese was a better bet than following his own boss Joe Maglioco and the power-mad Joe Bonanno. Sam DeCavalcanti. In January 1964, at age 41, Colombo became one of the youngest men ever to take over a mob family. Many within the mafia welcomed the regime change, but some had their doubts about Colombo's competence. What experience has he got? New Jersey boss Sam the Plumber DeCavalcanti complained in a conversation taped by the FBI. What does he know? But as Colombo settled into his position, some felt that he was the most progressive mob leader to come down the pike in some years. Others felt he was a self-centered showboat who sported excessively expensive suits and enjoyed being covered by the press. When he formed the Italian-American Civil Rights League, his fellow mobsters didn't know what to think. On one hand, they agreed with his cause, believing that all Italian Americans were unfairly targeted by law enforcement simply because of their heritage. But on the other hand, they traditionally thrived in the shadows away from public scrutiny. Colombo, they felt, was drawing too much attention to them. After an initial showing of support, mobsters tried to distance themselves from him, especially after the FBI discovered the damning list of mob donors. The attempt on his life at the League rally in 1971 was too public to have been a mafia hit. Despite the finger-pointing by the police, it just wasn't the way the mob did things. They would have chosen an isolated spot late at night and away from witnesses, not unlike the way his father was killed. Nevertheless, Colombo's incapacitation was not an unwelcome event to those who felt he had stepped dangerously out of bounds. Colombo survived the shooting, but just barely. Brain dead and unresponsive, he lived 7 more years, finally dying in 1978. During that time, the Colombo family closed ranks and chose not to reveal the identity of their new boss. The FBI worked for 3 years to find out who he was. Finally, they discovered that the new boss was Thomas DeBella, a wise guy who hardly registered on their radar screens. With only one conviction for bootlegging in 1932, they had no idea how important DeBella was in the family hierarchy. Keeping things quiet was a good idea, but no sooner did one mob star get vegetabled than another one found the spotlight, and this one threatened to shine brighter than even Joe Colombo. Junior's War. The Colombo family fell into chaos when the aging and ailing Thomas DeBella voluntarily stepped down as boss. His logical successor was the family's most powerful capo, Carmine Jr. Persico, but Persico had faced a relentless onslaught of prosecutions that sent him to prison for 10 of the 13 years prior to 1985, according to Carl Safakis in the Mafia Encyclopedia. Still, he managed to maintain his position as boss while incarcerated, empowering his brother Alphonse and Gennaro Jerry Langella to carry out his orders. During this period, the family concentrated their efforts on narcotics and labor racketeering. But as the government stepped up its campaign to stamp out organized crime in America, both Persico and Langella faced charges in the Mafia Commission case, where the government used the RICO statutes to bring down the heads of the New York families. Persico, who chose to represent himself in that trial, was outraged that the government could try him just for being a member of La Cosa Nostra. He showed his frustration in court by shouting out, "Without the Mafia, there wouldn't be no case here." In the end, Persico and Langella were both convicted and sentenced to 100 years each. Victor Little Vic, Orina Persico knew he would never see freedom again, but he had no intention of giving up the reins. He had ruled the family from prison before, and he would do it again, at least until his son Alphonse Ali Persico finished the prison term he was serving so that he could take over for his father. Carmine Persico appointed a distant cousin, Victor Little Vic Orina, as his acting boss in the meantime. Orina came to like wearing the crown. With the backing of Gambino family usurper John Gotti, Orina lobbied the commission in 1990 to have Persico ousted and himself recognized as the rightful boss. Colombo family members soon took sides. Tensions mounted. Persico loyalists struck first. On June 20, 1991, a five-man hit team led by Persico's consigliere Carmen Sessa converged on Orina's home on Long Island, ready to take him out. But one of the shooters jumped the gun, firing his weapon before the other men were in position. Orina saw them coming and managed to escape. This attempt on his life forced him to reach out to the other families for help. He renewed his petition to the commission to dethrone Persico and legitimize his position as undisputed boss. Sessa appealed to the commission on behalf of Persico, portraying Orina as an upstart who was betraying his boss. Greg Scarpa Sr. The commission was unable to broker a lasting peace for the Colombo family, and all hell broke loose on November 18, 1991. When two carloads of Orina supporters ambushed Persico capo Greg Scarpa Sr. in Brooklyn as he drove his daughter and granddaughter home. Hit men ran from their vehicles with guns drawn and converged on Scarpa's car. But Scarpa, one of the toughest gangsters the mob has ever seen, hit the accelerator and made a run for it, crashing into anything that got in his way. Fenders crunched and bullets flew. A few bystanders were injured, but Scarpa and his loved ones escaped unharmed. After the incident, Scarpa, who had been diagnosed with AIDS in 1986 after receiving a tainted blood transfusion from a member of his crew, entered the fray like a wild man. He had nothing to lose. Interestingly, Scarpa had been a secret FBI informer for 30 years, playing both sides of the fence to his own advantage. As for his legendary toughness, he matched Carmen Persico, who had once spit out a bullet fired into his face. In 1992, Scarpa took a bullet in the eye during a shootout. According to Jerry Capisi, Scarpa drove himself home, poured himself a scotch, and called the police. He lost the eye. 5 days after their attempt on Scarpa's life, Orina supporters came back hard, gunning down Henry Hank the Bank Smurra outside a donut shop in Brooklyn. This hit team was led by William Wild Bill Cutolo. War broke out. 12 men died in all. Cutolo killed 3 himself, as did Scarpa for the Persico camp. 2 of the victims were innocent bystanders. 15 other people were seriously wounded. Authorities cracked down on both sides to end the violence, which had gotten far out of hand. 41 Persico loyalists were sent to prison as well as Orina and his most powerful capo, Pasquale Patti Amato. The last casualty in the Colombo War, Orina capo John Scopo, was the handiwork of an 18-year-old assassin named John Papa, who had been dispatched by Greg Scarpa. Papa, who wears a large tattoo of 2 menacing eyes across his upper back under the inscription Morte prima di dishonor, death before dishonor, then gunned down his 2 partners in the Scopo murder for taking undeserved credit for the hit. Eventually Papa was convicted on 4 murder charges. He is now serving 4 life sentences. The Persico faction ultimately claimed victory, but the war had weakened the family as a whole. Some would have thought it was time to call for a truce and regroup, but Carmen Persico wasn't through yet. Behind bars ruling the family from his federal prison cell in Lompoc, California, Carmen Persico continued to pull strings in the hope of getting his son Alphonse on the throne. The college-educated Ali Persico was scheduled to be released from prison in May 1993, after which he would have taken over as boss. But the government had other ideas. They charged him with crimes relating to his participation in the Colombo War, hoping to keep him locked up, but in August 1994, he was found not guilty. Andrew Russo, perhaps not wanting to risk a parole violation for consorting with known criminals, Alphonse Persico laid low while one of his father's cousins, Andrew Russo, took over as acting boss in 1996. 3 years later, Russo was tried and convicted on racketeering and jury tampering charges. Alphonse took his place as acting boss, but within a few months he was arrested by the Coast Guard off the Florida Keys for gun possession. A search of his speedboat, the Lookin' Good, yielded a loaded pistol and shotgun. In 2000, he was tried on the gun charges and sentenced to 18 months in prison. On the day of his scheduled release, January 24, 2001, Alphonse Persico was indicted for loan sharking and held without bail as a suspect in the murder of William Wild Bill Cutolo. A staunch Orina supporter during the war, Cutolo had been appointed underboss by Persico as a peace gesture in 1999, but then suddenly disappeared on his way to a meeting with the boss. Within a week of his detainment on the new charges, Alphonse Persico and 10 other key Colombo members were slapped with federal indictments. According to ganglandnews.com, Alphonse Persico threw in the towel on December 20, 2001, pleading guilty to loan sharking, money laundering, and racketeering charges. A plea bargain deal called for him to pay the government $1 million and serve 13 years in prison. Persico still faces the possibility of execution if the government tries him for the murder of Wild Bill Cutolo. In January 2005, New York Magazine cited Carmen Jr. Persico as the boss of the Colombo family, with John Jackie DeRoss as his underboss, Joel Joe Waverly Carcase as his consigliere, and Thomas Tommy Schatz Joeli as his street boss. According to the magazine, Joeli has been able to bridge the gap that exists between mobsters who were shooting at each other a decade ago. But given their history, one has to wonder if the wounds of the Colombo War will ever heal.